This is House Planning Help episode 306. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Nigel Dutt. It's the second in a mini-series connected to the UK Passivhaus Awards, and his home, Devon Passivhaus, was on the shortlist, and it's not hard to see why. It's got so much going for it, a design that embraces its location, a beautifully crafted interior, and a reinvigoration of the historic walled garden that we're going to hear about in a moment. But it hasn't been without a bit of strife, largely in the form of getting planning consent. So we'll be focusing on that and seeing what we can learn. Somehow it's been 3 years since I moved into my passive house. I don't know where that time has gone. We've thoroughly enjoyed living here. And so it was quite fun the other day when Home Building and Renovating reached out and said, we're looking for someone who lives in a passive house who could give an honest review of what it's been like. So that was very easy for me to do. I think it is largely positive. The biggest considerations I think you have when you come to live in a passive house is just thinking about that summer comfort, because that's one of the benefits that you're going to get as well. But just milking it, how much summer comfort can I get? So what I'm going to do today is link that article into the show notes in case you fancy having a read. houseplanninghelp.com/306. Let's get to our featured interview with Nigel Dutt. And this was one of the projects that was shortlisted this year for the UK Passivhaus Awards. Let's find out more. I started by asking Nigel to tell me how this project began.
We moved down to Devon when we retired from a lifetime of being computer software nerds. And we knew the house we moved into wasn't our last resting place, and that we probably were going to have one more move, and we'd half thought about building. So we just started looking on the market, and we used to walk past what's turned out to be our plot quite regularly, and it was a completely overgrown jungle surrounded by 30-foot trees, and you couldn't see into it. And then suddenly one day somebody cleared it, and we even spotted that there was an enormous old brick wall running the whole length of it. So when that happened, we started to say, this could be interesting as a potential building plot. It was in the same village within sight of our old house. Obviously, since we'd stayed 15 years, we liked the place. So sort of one thing led to another. After that, we found out who owned it. They offered it to us. We found out that there'd been 2 failed planning applications. So being either brave or stupid, we bought the land and took the risk.
So you bought it before it had planning consent. Was that a worry at all?
No, just stupid. We did quite early on. We did a pre-application to say what would you think if we built a house here, and we actually got a negative response to that, saying that the top and bottom of it was it would mean an extra car, which seemed to be a very important thing, and it would not improve on a greenfield site. So that seemed to be where the planners were coming from. But they said if we wanted to pursue it, we would need to go the paragraph 55 route, now 79, and approach it that way.
If someone finds themselves in this position, what does that actually mean for building a house going down that route?
Paragraph 55 is actually an exception clause in the National Planning Framework. And it's the exception by which you could build a house in what's thought of as open countryside. And although to the layman, our plot isn't open countryside because it's between 2 other plots, only half an acre, the whole parish has been declared open countryside. And the 4 things you have to show is that you're truly outstanding architecturally or innovative, raising the standard of design more generally in rural areas, that it reflects the highest standards in architecture, and that it significantly enhances its immediate setting. Those are the criteria that the design is measured against. And it's not the planners who make that decision. It's a design review panel, and there's various ones throughout the country. So the planners are required to go to an independent review panel to get a conclusion on whether the house meets the standards, which they're not then obliged to accept. So to do that, you do a second pre-application, or you do it via a pre-application. So you say, I'm applying via the paragraph 55 route And in addition to your normal fees for a pre-app, you're paying for the privilege of going in front of a design review panel.
Now, obviously, you need some designs first of all. So did you approach a specialist in this particular area, or were you just going for outstanding architecture, or were you feeling your way because you were finding out about this?
So we were interested in architecture and look at a lot of architectural magazines. And so we knew some architects whose houses we particularly liked. And we got talking to them. We talked to one or two others, but the ones we particularly homed in on, we had almost matching Pinterest boards. And we did confront them with this problem that, would you be interested in going the paragraph 55 route, which they hadn't been before, on a site where we've already had planning tell us that they're unlikely to accept it. And the architects were willing to accept that challenge. So then we had to do quite a bit of the early design. I think it ended up with something like a 100-page design and access statement that was presented to the design review panel. I think we did about, between the architect and us, we did about a half-hour pitch in front of this panel, who then made the judgment on whether they thought it met the criteria for Para 55. So the answer was yes, we did spend quite a lot of time and effort and money in getting to the point where we presented to the review panel.
And then it was a green light.
So then we very quickly got a green light from the review panel. In fact, I think about 2 minutes after we'd finished, they sent us out and then brought us straight back. But then our problem pretty rapidly became that, notwithstanding the design review panel's judgment, the planners disagreed with them. So they disagreed both on their findings. They said they didn't feel it met those criteria I was talking about earlier. And also, they still basically didn't want another house in this area. And they felt that anything that we built on that half-acre plot would detract from the plot. It's a bit of a pity in some ways that they didn't see the plot before it had been cleared, because it was completely overgrown, as I said, surrounded by enormous trees, and was a dumping ground, basically. So we may have had a better result if we'd presented it like that, instead of presented it with a nice clean plot with its the whole length of the plot, which is about 60 or 70 meters. There is a 12-foot high, 200 and something year old brick wall, which was the dominant feature. And again, that was invisible before the site was cleared and all the ivy was moved off the whole length of it.
And the design of the house embraces that a lot, doesn't it? So maybe you just want to describe how things have evolved.
Yeah, so responding to the plot wasn't just a case of doing something that looked nice on the green field. It was very much a green field with woods behind it, and this whole 60 or 70 meter length, this wall that you could not avoid. So the architects designed a house that very much responded to that. In fact, the whole facade of the house is red brick. And they wanted to respond to the wall, but they didn't want to do a slavish imitation, a pastiche of it. So it was new bricks that matched the old bricks, but the house was altogether neater and sharper looking than a rural walled garden wall.
Now, just going back to planning then for a second. So you say that there was this almost conflict between the review panel, who was saying, yeah, love this, and the planners. So how does that get resolved?
Well, yes, it was interesting. When the planners responded to the second pre-application, which was the one that took us to the review panel, they said, well, we hear what the review panel said, but we disagree. We don't think a meeting with you would serve any further purpose. So if you are minded to continue, then you need to put in a full planning application. And we're telling you in advance that we will recommend refusal. So carrying on the bloody-minded theme, we did continue with a full planning application, brought forward the same design and access statement that we presented to the design review panel. And then we added a further document that basically was our arguments against their impending refusal. The other thing I should say is that normally that could be the end of the story, where the planners recommend refusal, but our local district councillor, who was also a member of the development committee of the local council, he requested us to go to committee because he disagreed with the planners. He was very positive about building an eco house, and his opinion was that the local district should be proud to have a paragraph 55 standard house built in the district, and especially proud if it has good eco credentials.
It's always going to create something outstanding, in my view. I mean, they are very varied, the paragraph 55, 79 builds, but it always produces something more interesting than the estate round the corner. That is for sure.
Yes, and it might be a bit niche as well, because it's one of these things that it's architects admiring another architect's design, and it's not necessarily the same sort of house that a member of the public or even us would think is a great house. And a lot of it's in the detail and the response to the site. I found now we're speaking to more architects who come and visit it.
Yeah, we'll put some links in the show notes so that we can check it out and see the plans and how it evolved. But so how did it finally get the go-ahead?
We eventually appeared in front of the development committee. You get a chance to speak for 3 minutes. I think the main point I made in my 3 minutes was, why go to a professional design review panel if you then pick and choose whether you like what they say? But I suspect one of the main things they spotted was that we actually had two people from the village, our direct neighbours, and then somebody across the field who was representing the parish council, who also had a view of the house, came and did 3-minute speeches in favour of the house. And I think the committee chairman made the point that they're very used to people making the 3-minute pitches against applications, but it's very unusual to have third parties come in and support an application. And we didn't pay them to do it or anything like that.
Why did they do it?
Well, one of them was the next door neighbour and had lived for 20 years next to our site, which had gradually become a very unsightly place. They said there were even rats running around in it. So they had a dump next to us. So they had a vested interest in wanting to see a nice house next to them. And the other person was speaking more for the parish council, who, for similar reasons to the district councillor, were quite positive about having this house there. They didn't feel that it impacted the village because they were also taking that layman's view that we were sitting between two other houses. We weren't expanding the envelope of the village or anything. So they just saw it as a positive. The other thing that was important was that our councillor then, who was also a member of the development committee, he made a very positive pitch, again, saying we should look at the positive aspects of this and be pleased to have a house like this in our area.
And it seems to me as well that in some ways you are preserving that historic wall, and I know as well the whole planting around that and reinvigorating the old garden. You know, that's a big plus in all this.
Yes, it was, because it was the classic walled garden that did all the fruit and food for the big house on the hill, which is now obviously not a big house on the hill anymore. We've gone back now to growing fruit and veg in the field and have done up the wall, and we've reinstituted fruit trees and growing on the wall in exactly the same places, using exactly the same wires and nails that were put in there over 200 years ago. So we've actually re-established the use of that wall that hadn't been used for about 60 years. And just as an aside, we had, because we've had articles in various papers, I was contacted by, they're now probably in their 80s, but the last generation of children that used to play in that walled garden when their parents were the owners of the big house on the hill. And they were all incredibly positive about what we'd done. So none of them were saying, oh, you spoilt our lovely field. They were all saying it's fantastic that you've put a nice house in this place and you're growing apples in the very place where we used to scrump apples when we were kids.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because it's interesting. You've got the wall, the dominant feature, and you've talked a little bit about the design. But what did you want from the house, and how does that all shape up against, trying to balance this with the historic part that you've got there? Were there any constraints to think about?
We were happy with all that side of it. So the design that the architects did in response to the wall, etc. We were surprised at first because we in our mind, a completely different, maybe 2-story house was what we were thinking we'd build, maybe because we hadn't really thought it beyond it. But we didn't want to go above the height of the wall when it got to doing the design for the review panel. It was obvious that would be a key feature, to respond to the wall, not build above it. So slightly unexpectedly, we went downwards a bit. So we've got a partial basement, which had never crossed our mind. But to get the square footage that we wanted, and also to have somewhere to put the plant room, and then with a flat roofed house, somewhere to use as a attic equivalent. We went down, and it, to some extent, spoilt our embodied carbon credentials, because by definition, you're then building a whole, sticking a concrete box in it, etc. So we knew that was a downside, and also in cost, but we bit the bullet and did that. We focused more on performance of the house rather than embodied cost of building it, really, because we were pushed into that direction by having to do this sort of design. I mean, we could still have avoided it and just done a smaller house, but we went ahead anyway.
And Passivhaus was what you targeted. What's great is that it seems like it's not a passive house. You don't look at it and think, oh, that must be a passive house. So it's led by the architecture. But were there any challenges along the way for getting certified passive house?
The architects and the builders and the guys who made the SIP system that we used were all used to building and designing to passive house principles, but none of them had a certified passive house, taken that extra step. So that's probably where we as clients were pushing them. They were careful not to commit to it at planning stage, because they knew it was difficult because of the shape of the house and one or two other things. So we didn't want to commit to it in advance and then have it come back and bite us if we'd failed. So we said we were building to passive house principles, and then we privately as clients always had certification as our goal. So we made very sure, for instance, that right from the start we got passive house consultants involved. Any components that were passive house sensitive, if you like the windows, wall constructions, the roof lights, that they were all passive house certified products to start with, so that we wouldn't just shoot ourselves in the foot on day one.
Tell us a little bit about the construction of the building then.
So the main construction of the building is by advanced SIPS panels. So they're from a make called Four Wall, and they're made in this country by a company called Tribus. They had previously built, in fact, the first certified passive house in Devon, because they used to be timber frame builders, and they moved that expertise across to building with SIPS panels. So they manufacture these SIPS panels in their factory. They designed the house, having taken the architect's plans. They designed the house in terms of the panels that would be needed to construct it. But as well as the panels, because of their history, they were also able to do the floors and the roof of the house. So basically they were a sort of one-stop shop for doing the main infrastructure of the house. They took about 2 months to put up the house using the panels, but at the same time, they did floors, roofs, the windows were fitted, so when they left, it was a completely built airtight house, and the only thing it was short of was the membrane to seal the roof, which had to be done by a specialist.
And then the actual interior and so forth, that was also a continuation of what the architects were doing for you, wasn't it?
Yes. One of the things the main architect, Fiona McLean, said was that we're homemakers, not shape makers. So they don't get high on building exotic shapes, which you sometimes need to do to get paragraph 55, but they focus on it as a home for people to live in. So they do everything from the normal architectural stuff, the outside design and the basic internal structure, but they also do all the lighting design, all the joinery design, the kitchen design. So we didn't need to go out to third-party designers to do all that stuff. They did a holistic job, and it kept continuity from the whole design literally from outside to inside. I guess our main contribution was that we were most keen on the energy side of it. So we were much more involved in deciding what we wanted to do in terms of the kit we put in the house and who to choose to do that. And again, we've kept an eye on that from then on to report back on the performance of the house.
Yeah, because you are in a pretty good way when it comes to look at the stats, aren't you? Maybe we should examine that. So tell us about the renewables that you've incorporated and how life is living in a passive house.
We've ended up with an all-electric house, which makes it easy in terms of quantifying the energy. And then SolarEdge, who do the inverters, provide very nice software for letting you monitor minute by minute how the house performs. And being, as I said, long-term software people, that's fine with us. So we do watch the dials a lot. And for various reasons, we've got a private borehole and private sewage system, which is, I guess, as a result of living in the country. So our only bill is the electric bill. And then we've been very careful to design the solar side of it as well as the electrical componentry side of it. The headlines are that we're about 40% energy positive. We generate about 10.5 meg in a year, and we use about 7.5, obviously by a mixture of our solar power and going to the grid. We are running cost negative in that our only bill is electric, and that's a little bit negative. I think it's minus 100 or 200 quid, our electricity bill. And then on top of that, we've got the grant for using air source heat pump. So I think overall we're a bit over £1,000 negative in costs, which means after a few centuries we might have paid for the house, but I don't think we'll be around to celebrate that.
And a big difference to where you used to live before.
Yes, it's one good thing is that we only actually moved about 250 meters. So we physically can look back at our old house. And I think the cost is something like minus 1,000 now compared to something like plus 4,000 or 5,000 with all the bills. And the difference in carbon cost is pretty amazing, because I calculated that it's something like it was 12,000 kilograms of carbon a year was the cost of running the other house. And it's about 300 in this house. And then that again is offset by the fact that we contribute to the grid from our solar power, which actually, according to our certifier, gives us a negative footprint to the tune of 0.5 ton to 1 ton of carbon dioxide a year. The other thing I should say about the energy stuff is that the site was judged to be ecologically negligible when we had our survey done. And in fact, the guy that did the survey said that if we planted one daffodil on our site, we'd increase its ecological footprint. But the landscape design and virtually all the implementation has been done by my wife. And she's planted, or with a bit of help from friends, I think it's about 120 trees, 300 meters of hedging, thousands of plants, and is growing fruit and veg, etc., from the walled garden next to us. That's been quite a significant contributor, as well as we planted a little copse of trees on the main glazed side of the house to get some solar shading through that. And it's obviously not as good as it's going to be right now, but the trees are going to grow a bit. But we put them in a bit bigger than you might put trees in normally to try and get some instant effect of that.
Well, while we're on that topic, I mean, you've got some bigger glazed areas, and also probably what I see least is that internal area as you come into the house, the greeting area where
Yes.
you've got a big piece of glazing. So does that mean you're overheating? Probably not. I know that you've got a good plan for it, but what is that plan?
I guess the courtyard, you walk into the house, yes, and you're in this tiled courtyard area, which is intended to look a bit like an extension of the garden. And what it does is about 4x5 square meter roof light over it. And that was going to be the biggest danger for overheating. But we've put an external blind over that, unlike the other windows in the house. And that does make a big difference. We can feel the difference as you bring that blind over.
But does that mean you have to have that closed a lot of the time?
If the sun is shining, I think it's probably our rule. If it's a reasonably sunny day, we close it from the beginning of the day. And we find that isn't a problem, because it just means you get a slightly shady interior, which is actually quite relaxing. You don't sit in there thinking, oh, I wish the sun was shining on me, because you can walk out the door if you want that to happen. The biggest risk, in fact, that our certifier flagged up in our certification report was overheating. And that was more from the big glass side of the house. One side of the house, and it's the southwest facing, is all glass. And it would strike a Passivhaus expert as quite unusual, because there's no big overhang on the roof there or any shading. And our aim was that we'd see how it went. We always kept at the back of our mind that we could add some sort of shading. There's a big terrace down that whole length of the house, and we could put a shading of some sort on that terrace if we found overheating to be a problem.
Well, how well do the trees work? Because that's why you've got the trees there, but you're going to have to wait a few years to know whether...
And I think in practice, looking at the angle of the sun, etc., it's going to be a 4 or 5 year job. We had exactly the same trees in the old house, so we're familiar with how fast they grow. So I'd say they're not contributing a lot now, but they've got the potential to. We've got a big sliding door on that side, and then doors on each axis of the house. So we find that in practice, we can open doors and get through drafts in the house, and it works just fine. We virtually never get heating over, say, 25 degrees when we're in the house in occupancy. The only time we get measured overheating is when we're away and we don't have the option to open the doors and windows. And then we've seen 30 or 32 for a few days in the house. But it doesn't matter to us because we're not there. And we find even coming back with a house like that, we can get it back down within an hour or so to something like 24, 25.
Well, I think that if you're able to open the windows, because I understand some people in certain locations, if you're in a more built up area, that might be problematic. But where you are, yeah, and I'm the same with my house, just a lot of the time in the summer, the windows are open just because it's a natural thing to do. And, you know, it keeps it cool. The only time you want to seal up is if it's really, really hot, I suppose.
Yes, you're exactly right. That's the upside of being in the country, that we can open our front door and we're not worrying about people coming in. The only slightly strange thing, which is the other side of living in the country, is that in our first summer, just when it was hottest, there's a field just the other side of the lane from us, and an enormous pile of pig manure was dumped literally just the other side of the fence from us. So probably as the crow flies, 25 meters from our front door. And then apart from not being the most fragrant, it also brought in 1 million flies. And we had to keep the main big sliding door shut because of the flies. But that was quickly fixed because we told the friendly farmer, and in future years, I think he only does it every 4 years or something, he'll just dump it the other side of the field. But it's a good example of unforeseen consequences. We couldn't have predicted that. Or maybe if we'd been smart farming types, we'd have predicted it.
I know a few cases of where people have put fly screens in. I mean, this is not something that I think I would do necessarily, but we get flies in the house as well. It's just par for the course.
It's funny, though, there's a psychological thing, I think, that if you've got no barrier between the kitchen and the outside, not even having to slide open a fly screen or something, it makes you much more light. And it's a funny human nature thing. If you had to slide a sliding screen and put it backwards and forwards, it sort of makes it just that tiny bit less attractive to just mooch outside with a drink or whatever it is. But we know we've got that option, the same as we've got the option to put, say, a brise soleil over the terrace. We're just keeping a watching brief. I think we've got a design for if we wanted to do it.
Now, it sounds to me that you've actually had a really good build and that the main challenge was the planning. But has there been anything that you've learned through this experience that you do differently or point out to other people?
Not that we necessarily do different. I think the big thing we found, and this is obvious to us we spent our life doing big software projects, in fact, working together on them. And there's a rule of thumb always in software that if you fix something in the design stage, it costs X. If you find the problem in the implementation phase, it costs you 10X. And if you find the problem when you've shipped the product, it costs you 100X. So we knew that taking time over design to look ahead and solve these problems was worth doing. So we got Warm in as consultants during the design phase. They pointed out potentially risky areas in the architect's design, especially things like that oriel window that pokes out to the front, which is sort of anathema to a passive house designer. But the architect stuck to the design, and working with Warm, they were able to do the right things at critical point junctures to keep things airtight and stop thermal bridging and all that stuff.
And how have you found living there?
Fine. The passive house delivers what it promises. We find it comfortable as long as we can open the windows in the summer. And the subjective thing we notice in the winter is that compared to any other house we've lived in before, is you actually get taken by surprise when it's cold outside. You often open the front door, you walk into the blast of cold air, and you had no idea it was going to be like that. So I suppose that's a measure of the fact that it's working, even though we can see on the readouts what the temperature is outside.
That's a nice anecdote. Is there anything else that you think you should mention to someone who's looking to self-build and might help them in their own journey?
Well, going back to the lessons learned, we had a passive house champion on site the whole time. So it turned out the guy, Russ Hancock, who was the builder's on-site project manager, became a convert to passive house. He went and did training at Warm. He had the book in front of him on his desk the whole time. He educated anyone who came on site. So as well as doing the standard thing you have to do with people coming on site about health and safety, he imposed the Passivhaus lifestyle on them. So that was great. And he personally every day checked the site, checked what the guys had done. He did a lot of the taping himself. He got very vested in things like the days when we had our air tightness testing. He took as a personal challenge to pass those tests. So I think we'd have had problems without somebody like that every minute of the day on site, making sure we achieve the Passivhaus standard. And that was somebody who'd never heard of Passivhaus before he started on our project.
Well, it's a beautiful piece of architecture, and internally as well, beautifully finished. So well done to everyone involved. And thank you for chatting to us today, Nigel.
Right. My pleasure.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this episode, houseplanninghelp.com/306. We always like to summarize these conversations, so that's what you'll find there. We just give you the information, the key points, so that you can absorb them once again. We've got photos of the build. You can watch the video that my production company, Regen Media, produced. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question. You can either do that within the show notes or on social media. We'll link to Nigel's website, to McLean Quinlan, and to the Passivhaus Trust. All of that information within houseplanninghelp.com/306. Quick hub update before I head out of here. This is the online resource to help you, particularly if you're in the early stages. You're just getting to grips with what will it entail if I build myself a house or if I retrofit a house. So it's our online resource. We have all sorts of goodies in there, digital archive to help you. For example, our in-depth video case studies. And we've just added another chapter of the Kimber story. This one is our first retrofit project that we're covering. This is a retrofit to Passivhaus standard of a mid-terrace Victorian property. Really interesting. And we're at the stage now where it's just going to be gutted so that we can let our work take place. And that means a lot coming out. There's also the access of this particular site is a tough one. So we find out how they're dealing with that as well, and look at how you make sure that you hire the right builder for the job, because you don't want to get halfway through this project and having taken everything out and then run into problems. So really interesting episode. That's up there. We got a new live training as well. 2 more architects from Archetype, that's Polly Upton and Kurt Rushby, have completed a house build. We always love it when architects have a go as well, particularly looking at finances and how they make sure they are clever with their money. So that all in this particular live training. I will endeavour to get them onto the podcast as well further down the line, because it's such an interesting story. We've got our courses, we've got our private members only forum as well. And if you want to chat with me, well, we do office hours. So that's a section of each week that I put aside just to chat with you with wherever you are in your project and see how I can help. houseplanninghelp.com/join to find out more. Next time, Mike Webb is my guest. It's the last of our podcast connected to the UK Passivhaus Awards. Now, he was actually the developer behind Seaton Beach Apartments, not necessarily self-built, but it's his attitude that has really impressed me, and I need to quiz him. So that's what we'll do next time. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.